Okay, so today we'll be annotating the second part of chapter 10 of Henry Jekyll's full statement of the case. Remember we did the first couple of sentences in the previous video. So that night I had come to the fatal crossroads. Remember, crossroads often seen as a moment of kind of decision. Had I approached my discovery in a more noble spirit, had I risked the experiment while under the empire of generous or pious aspirations, all must have been otherwise, and from these agonies of death and birth, I had come forth an angel instead of a fiend. So he's talking about how, remember, he was stuck as kind of Hyde when he woke up one morning. He took that cup and he woke up as Jekyll. And of course, he's woken up as an angel instead of a fiend, and a fiend is another word for a devil. And he's kind of talking about himself as Jekyll, as an angel, and as something maybe we have to question that. Because one of the things this chapter throws up is that idea that perhaps Jekyll is at fault just like Hyde is, and maybe Jekyll is blind to that sometimes, because he's the one who chose to do this to himself, and he consistently chose to become Hyde and do terrible things. So it is kind of a big kind of moral question. As who is to blame here, Hyde or Jekyll? The drug had no discriminating action. It was neither diabolical nor divine. It but shook the doors of the prison house of my disposition. So he talks about how when he's Jekyll, he feels like he's in a prison. And like the captives of Philippi, that which stood within ran forth. At that time, my virtue slumbered. It kind of slept. His virtue, by the way, being his kind of good side. My evil, kept awake by ambition, was alert and swift to seize the occasion, and the thing that was projected was Edward Hyde. So notice how evil is often kind of associated with being quick and alert and nimble, just the way like Hyde moved. Hence, although I had now two characters as well as two appearances, one was wholly evil, that's Hyde. Wholly, by the way, meaning kind of completely. And the other was still the old Henry Jekyll, that incongruous compound. Now, incongruous is a good word. It's like when, it's when you've kind of got like opposites, things that don't fit together nicely. He's kind of an odd mix. And it's kind of a criticism of that mix of good and evil, of whose reformation and improvement I had already learned to despair. He despairs when he is Jekyll, trying to reform himself and improve and be a good person. He doesn't like that. The movement was thus wholly towards the worse, so he's feeling himself dragged towards this more evil side of himself. Even at that time, I had not yet conquered my aversion to the dryness of a life of studies. So he's saying here, I'd not yet conquered aversion is kind of like my hatred or dislike to the dryness. He finds kind of studying and being this academic, he finds it boring and dull. And remember, this is the Victorian era where it's a great time of kind of academic inquiry and of discovery. And he actually finds this a really boring thing to do. He wishes he was just out there doing what he wanted rather than sitting in his study reading and kind of studying things. I would still be merrily disposed at times, and as my pleasures were, to say the least, undignified, and I was not only well known and highly considered, but growing towards the elderly man, this incoherency of my life was daily growing more unwelcome. So he doesn't like being old either. He sort of hates aging and being kind of like a respectable old man. He doesn't like it. It was on this side that my new power tempted me until I fell in slavery. So he feels like he's been tempted, a little bit like Adam and Eve in the Bible, tempted by the fruit on the tree, until I fell into slavery. So he becomes a slave to evil. He just, he's like I've said before, it's a bit like he's addicted. I had but to drink the cup, to doff at once the body of the noted professor, and to assume like a thick cloak that of Edward Hyde. I smiled at the notion. He finds some joy in this. He likes the secret that only he knows. It seemed to me at times to be humorous, and I made my preparations with the most studious care. So, he finds it humorous. I think there's a kind of, again, we get a kind of the true sense of Jekyll there. He kind of enjoys indulging his more evil side. And remember, like, is it funny? I mean, he ends up killing someone. So, how fun is it really? I took and finished that house and furnished that house in Soho, to which Hyde was tracked by the police. So Jekyll sets up that house for him. He furnishes it. He sets it out. To which Hyde was trapped by the police and engaged as housekeeper a creature whom I well knew to be silent and unscrupulous. That was the housekeeper that came to the door when Utterson arrived with the police earlier. On the other side, I announced to my servants that a Mr. Hyde, whom I described, was to have full liberty meaning freedom, and power about my house in the square, and to parry mishaps. I even called and made myself a familiar object in my second character, so we get here about how the servants knew about him. I next drew up that will, so we get the mention of that will that was a key plot point earlier on in the book, to which you so much objected. Remember, you here is directly to Lanyon, direct address to Lanyon. To Utterson. So that if anything befell me in the person of Dr. Jekyll, I could enter on that of Edward Hyde without pecuniary, that means financial, loss. So he's thinking, if I do disappear because I get stuck as Jekyll, then at least I won't lose all my money because Hyde will be able to access that money. And thus fortified, as I supposed on every side, I began to profit by the strange immunities of my position. So he feels kind of immune, and one of the reasons that's doing that, and it was in the quiz actually, is this sense of anonymity. When he's Hyde, he can kind of get away with things that Jekyll will never be kind of found guilty of. Men have hired bravos to transact their crimes. Bravos are like assassins. While their own person and reputation sat under shelter. I was the first that ever did so for his pleasures. So he's saying that I'm the first person that's able to commit his own crimes for his own pleasure. Again, there's kind of enjoyment there. And there's this slight arrogance about Jekyll. He thinks what he's done is so clever, he's so proud of it. And we talked a bit about this before. There's a kind of hubris, which is excessive pride. And whenever he smiles about it, that's the kind of reading I get from it anyway. I was the first that could thus plod in the public eye with a load of genial respectability, so like a respectable Victorian gentleman, and in a moment, like a schoolboy, strip off these lendings and spring headlong into the sea of liberty. But for me, in my impenetrable mantle, the safety was complete. Think of it, I did not even exist. So remember, Hyde is not even a real person. When he becomes Jekyll, when Jekyll becomes Hyde, he doesn't exist anymore. So, this kind of thrill of not even existing. Let me but escape into my laboratory door. Give me but a second or two to mix and swallow the draught that I had always standing ready. Draught is just like a drink of medicine. And whatever he had done, Edward Hyde would pass away like the stain of breath upon a mirror. Lovely simile there about how easily he can fade away. And there in his stead, quietly at home, trimming the midnight lamp in his study, a man who could afford to laugh at suspicion would be Henry Jekyll. Okay, so, he would be this kind of innocent man who could afford to laugh. No one would ever suspect him. This kind of noble figure, this respectable gentleman of Henry Jekyll. And again, this was something that Victorian readers would be very interested in, a kind of noble figure getting away with crimes and no one realizing it. It makes me think a bit of Jack the Ripper, because there were lots of rumors that he was a kind of respectable man, kind of murdering prostitutes around London in Whitechapel and getting away with it. Okay, and there's something about Jekyll being a similar Jack the Ripper type figure here, so some good context there. The pleasures which I made haste to seek in my disguise were, as I have said, undignified. So the kind of what he's doing very kind of unspeakable acts, quite grotesque. Like I've said before, could be sex, violence, drugs, undignified, something a gentleman would not do. I would scarce use a harder term. But in the hands of Edward Hyde, they soon began to turn towards the monstrous. So he starts to be committing kind of monstrous acts by his own admission. When I would come back from these excursions, I was often plunged into a kind of wonder at my vicarious depravity. Vicarious is kind of like thoughtless. And depravity is really savage. Depraved acts are kind of terrible, terrible acts. And again, that could link to sex, violence, all kinds of things. But he is kind of shocked at how truly evil he can be. This familiar that I called out of my own soul, familiars, I don't know if you remember from Macbeth, but these are like a familiar is like a spirit, an evil spirit. And if you think about witches, it's often like cats and witches. And a black cat is often the familiar of a witch. So he's calling himself like an evil spirit, really. This familiar that I called out of my own soul and sent forth alone to do his good pleasure was a being inherently malign and villainous. So really, villainous to the core. His every act and thought centered on self, so he only cares about himself, really selfish, drinking pleasure with bestial avidity from any degree of torture to another. So he drinks on pleasure. He just is all about kind of self gratification. He just wants to please himself all the time. With a kind of almost like he's an animal. Bestial just sort of means and avidity sort of means like joy. So with an animal joy, from any degree of torture to another, relentless like a man of stone. So a lovely simile there as well. And I think that bit, like a man of stone, that idea that he's unfeeling. Everything he does, he's just like stone. He doesn't have a guilty conscience about it. He just does it because he enjoys it and he wants to do it. Henry Jekyll stood at times aghast before the acts of Edward Hyde. So Jekyll was shocked, by what Hyde gets up to. But the situation was apart from ordinary laws and insidiously relaxed the grasp of conscience. So he feels like his guilty conscience is kind of not really there, not present. Which again makes us question about who is guilty here. It was Hyde after all, and Hyde alone that was guilty. That is definitely worth picking out there, because we can question that. Is it Hyde alone? ? It's Jekyll who made this happen. It's Jekyll that chooses to become Hyde when he takes the drink. So is it truly Hyde all alone that is guilty here? Jekyll was no worse. He woke again to his good qualities seemingly unimpaired. He would even make haste, where it was possible, to undo the evil done by Hyde. So Jekyll then, when he returns to his normal state, he tries to kind of cover up for some of the things Hyde has done and make them, or make them better. And thus his conscience slumbered. Into the details of the infamy, and infamy is kind of like criminal acts, at which I thus connived, for even now I can scarce grant that I committed it. Remember, he says I committed it there, not Hyde. Interesting pronoun use there. I have no design of entering. I mean but to point out the warnings and the successive steps with which my chastisement approached. So he doesn't tell us about the acts that he's got up to. I met with one accident which, as it brought on no consequence, I shall no more than mention. An act of cruelty to a child. And this is now going to link back all the way back to chapter 1 and Enfield's story. So everything we'd heard before this, it helps us for our kind of timeline of this narrative that he's going to take us through. We're now up to chapter 1, where we had that incident of the girl getting trampled by Hyde at the beginning of the book. Aroused against me the anger of a passer-by, whom I recognised the other day in the person of your kinsman. So this is Enfield. So he recognised them, remember when they were at the window, and so he maybe remembered about that incident. The doctor and the child's family joined him. There were moments when I feared for my life, and at last, in order to pacify their too just resentment, Edward Hyde had to bring them to the door and pay them in a cheque drawn in the name of Henry Jekyll. So this is all about the beginning of the book, yeah? So chapter 1. But this danger was easily eliminated from the future by opening an account at another bank in the name of Edward Hyde himself, and when by sloping my own hand backward, so we get a kind of clue there, about the handwriting. I had supplied my double with a signature. I thought I sat beyond the reach of fate. So we learn that after this event, where he had to get Jekyll to sign that check, he then opened up a bank account in the name of Hyde, so that would never happen again. Some 2 months before the murder of Sir Danvers, so we get a kind of time reference here about what's placing us in context of where we are in the story. I'd been out for one of my adventures, had returned at a late hour, and woke the next day in bed with somewhat odd sensations. So he feels kind of odd after this late night he's out. It was in vain I looked about me. In vain I saw the decent furniture and tall proportions of my room in the square. In vain that I recognised the pattern of the bed curtains and the design of the mahogany frame. Something still kept insisting that I was not where I was, that I had not wakened where I seemed to be, but in a little room in Soho, where I was accustomed to sleep in the body of Edward Hyde. So he feels like he's woken up somewhere. I was not where I was. He thinks that something's not right about how he's woken up in Soho. I smiled to myself, and in my psychological way began lazily to inquire into the elements of this illusion, occasionally, even as I did so, dropping back into a comfortable morning doze. So he's kind of sleepy, not worried about it. I was still so engaged when, in one of my more wakeful moments, my eye fell upon my hand. So he looks at his hand. Now the hand of Henry Jekyll, as you have often remarked, was professional in shape and size. It was large, firm, white, and comely. So this idea that his hand was kind of professional, it was large, and all these kind of things. But the hand which I now saw clearly enough in the yellow light of a mid-London morning, lying half shut on the bedclothes, was lean, corded, knuckly, of a dusky pallor, and thickly shaded with a smart growth of hair. It was the hand of Edward Hyde. So we get these two descriptions. We get the absolute juxtaposition here of his healthy hand as Jekyll versus the kind of lean, kind of slightly hairy hand as Hyde. And something here just to bring up again about context. We'll probably have a lesson where we look a bit closer at this. But at the time, there was some kind of criminologists, so people that study criminals, who believed that the kind of shape, the shape of parts of our body would indicate kind of whether or not we were a criminal. They kind of thought about criminals as being somewhat like different to ordinary human beings. Like their hands were different, the measurement of their feet were kind of different. So those kind of ideas are in this book, and definitely here where we talk about the hand. I must have stared upon it for near half a minute, such as I was in the mere stupidity of wonder, before terror woke up in my breast. There's that terror again. We've said that so much in the book. Common motif, woke up in my breast as sudden and startling as the crash of cymbals, and bounding from my bed I rushed to the mirror. At the sight that met my eyes, my blood was changed into something exquisitely thin and icy. So he gets that same reaction that so many other people have had when they've encountered seeing Hyde. So he had enjoyed it, earlier on, but now he gets this fear of seeing himself this way. Yes, I had gone to bed Henry Jekyll. I had awakened Edward Hyde. So there's something here about how he's losing control. It was that he could take the potion and then he could switch back and forth, but now it's starting to happen when he falls asleep and not when he wants it to. So he's losing control of this kind of the ability to just choose when he becomes Hyde. Now it's happening when he doesn't even want it to happen. How was this to be explained? I asked myself, and then with another bound of terror, how was it to be remedied? And that means like fixed. It was well on in the morning. Last page. The servants were up. All my drugs were in the cabinet. So he's desperate for these drugs. A long journey down 2 pairs of stairs, through the back passage, across the open court, and through the anatomical theatre, from where I was then standing horror-struck. It might indeed be possible to cover my face, but of what use was that, when I was unable to conceal the alteration in my stature? Now this actually rings a bell. This reminds me of Paul perhaps seeing him earlier on. When he mentioned in that last chapter, he said he saw him sneaking back into the house. And then, with an overpowering sweetness of relief, it came back upon my mind that the servants were already used to the coming and going of my second self. Okay, so it wasn't the bit that Paul was talking about, but it's a similar kind of image. Um, I had soon dressed as well as I was able in clothes of my own size, had soon passed through the house where Bradshaw stared and drew back at seeing Mr. Hyde at such an hour. So even Bradshaw here still scared of seeing Hyde, like everyone feels that kind of feeling of disgust throughout the book. And in such a strange array, and 10 minutes later, Dr. Jekyll had returned to his own shape and was sitting down with a darkened brow to make a feint of breakfasting. So, he's able to return to himself. Interestingly, this word darkened, he does feel like this, somehow as a character he's kind of darkened. But he's able to return himself. He takes the drugs, sneaks back in his hide, and he's back to himself again. Small indeed was my appetite. This inexplicable, unexplainable incident, this reversal of my previous experience seemed like the Babylonian finger on the wall, to be spelling out the letters of my judgment, and I began to reflect more seriously than ever before on the issues and possibilities of my double existence. So he's starting to see the problems of it, the issues. That part of me which I had the power of projecting had lately been much exercised and nourished. So because he's being Hyde so much, he's kind of growing this side of himself. It had seemed to me of late as though the body of Edward Hyde had grown in stature. So he's getting taller as he does more evil things. He's physically getting bigger. As though when I wore that form, I were conscious of a more generous tide of blood. It's like his blood's flowing better when that happens. And I began to spy a danger that if this was much prolonged, the balance of my nature might be permanently overthrown. So he's saying that this is a key word in this book, balance. The balance of good and evil might be permanently overthrown, the power of voluntary change be forfeited, and the character of Edward Hyde become irrevocably mine, as in forever mine. So he's worried that he's going to lose the balance and he's going to become Hyde forever, whether he likes it or not. And he's going to lose complete control and, in fact, wipe out Jekyll once and for all. The power of the drug had not been always equally displayed. Once, very early in my career, it had totally failed me. Remember when they looked at the book in chapter 10, they picked it up? Was it chapter 10? No, sorry, we're reading chapter 10 now. Who was it? Was it Lanyon that read that? It was Lanyon, sorry. It was in chapter 9, where Lanyon read his book and he saw total failure inside the book. Well, here is that bit here. So we get a kind of explanation of some of those experiments in the book. And remember, as a final chapter, this is very much, I'll just write it down here, a denouement, where we get so many answers to every little clue that's been in the book so far. And here's one about that book of experiments that we saw earlier on in chapter 9 that Lanyon found. And then I have been obliged on more than one occasion to double, and once with an infinite risk of death to treble the amount, and these rare uncertainties had cast hitherto the sole shadow on my contentment. Now, however, and in the light of that morning's accident, I was led to remark that whereas in the beginning the difficulty had been to throw off the body of Jekyll, it had of late gradually but decidedly transferred itself to the other side. So it was once difficult, when he first was doing the experiments, to get rid of being Jekyll, but now he's finding it difficult to get rid of being Hyde. Okay, all things therefore seem to point to this, that I was slowly losing hold. He's slowly losing control of my original and better self, and becoming slowly incorporated with my second and worse. Okay, so that's the end of the section I asked you to read, and that's the end of the bit I'm going to annotate today. But clearly at the end of this section, we can see that Hyde is losing the battle of good and evil. And evil is very much winning in this instance. It's taking over him and he's struggling to control it. And obviously we'll find out more about that when I ask you to read the next 4 pages in tomorrow's lesson. Anyway, thanks for watching. Make sure you've got the annotations. Feel free to go back and pause if I was babbling on a bit too quickly or you didn't quite understand. But that's it for today, and I will be setting you a non-live lesson tomorrow. Thanks.